Hello, and welcome to this breakout session about content moderator, resilience, and wellness. This discussion in this session will focus on the tech-based tools, techniques, and policies that organizations are employing to protect the actual humans who are ultimately responsible for reviewing and moderating malicious and non-compliant content. My name is Caitlin Borgman. I'm Vice President of Business Development at Thorn, an organization that builds technology to defend children from online sexual abuse and exploitation. I'm joined today by 4 industry thought leaders who work within organizations that either provide or use solutions to meet this evolving and emerging challenge when the human experience intersects the explosive growth of internet technology. So with that, I've asked each one of our guests to introduce themselves, their organizations, and their role as it relates to SafetyTech. And we'll start with Chango Slim from Dropbox. Changos?
Hi, Caitlin. Thank you for having me. My name is Chango Slim. I am the head of content safety at Dropbox. So our team is responsible for processing all reports of acceptable use policy violations, and that ranges from terror content to revenge porn to copyright notice and takedown, but most predominantly child sexual abuse imagery, or CSAI.
Great. Erica?
Video platform, and we provide offerings that allow our users to create, host, stream, and distribute content online. And as the director of policy at Vimeo, my job, as it respects to this panel, is to develop Vimeo's internal policies on a variety of important issues, including our acceptable use policy. And I work very closely with the trust and safety team to ensure we can enforce these policies in a consistent and objective manner, in a way that we can keep our platform and our community safe. And I pass it to Naheed.
Thank you. My name is Naheed Sheikh. I am one of the co-founders of the Workplace Wellness Project. We partner with tech platforms to help build wellness programming to mitigate the effects of vicarious trauma and trauma that are risk factors inherent in doing content moderation work. In addition to supporting individuals on the front lines, we work very holistically with with the entire organization, including policy, Eng, and HR teams, as a way of building cultures of resilience on a wider spectrum. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Naheed. Justin, we'll round it out.
Hi, everyone. Justin Davis, CEO and co-founder of Spectrum Labs. We help some of the world's largest social networks, dating apps, gaming companies recognize and respond to toxic content by providing an AI-powered content moderation platform. We detect roughly 40 or so behaviors across text and voice, and we do this across any given language on the fly.
Great. Thank you all again so much for being here with us, sharing your knowledge and your experience on this topic. For the audience, we have 45 minutes, maybe a little bit less than that now. So audience questions are certainly welcome. We'll do our best to get to them. So appreciate your understanding on that. I'd like to start with Changos and Erica. You and your organizations are really on the front line of moderating content. So I'm curious to know how you're using technology today to moderate content. And then more specifically, can you share some examples of how that's helped from a resilience and wellness perspective with those teams that are actually responsible for it? Changos, why don't you start? I'll lead with you.
Sure. So we consulted a lot with Naheed's program prior to building out our team and the tool that they would be using to review and report all child sexual abuse imagery, or CSAI. So our tools have specific wellness features built in, like the ability to automatically blur content if specific content pops up on the screen and it's too much to handle. Reviewers can press a hotkey to blur it. Or if there's, a well-intentioned coworker who might walk behind one of the team members while they're reviewing, they can automatically blur it. There is the ability to view images in black and white, just because it's less vibrant than color and less likely to stick with you. Videos are automatically muted when they're played, and they're also spliced into thumbnails so that reviewers don't need to watch the whole video. I've also heard of other companies providing tools that play videos backwards or out of order. The reason being that videos are most likely to stick with reviewers, given that they provide a story. And so by playing it backwards or out of order, they're less likely to stick with you. Different things work for different reviewers. You know, we've had reviewers say, I don't want the image to be minimized. I just want to see it and classify it and get it out of the way. Or I don't want it to be viewed in black and white because I don't want to associate all print with CSAI. So really different things work for different reviewers. And what we want to do is just give them the option. Additionally, we will pre-label content that's previously been reviewed and classified so that reviewers do not need to classify it again. We auto-report content that meets certain criteria for eligibility, which not only gets that content off the site quickly, but it also minimizes unnecessary exposure to reviewers. And finally, our reviewers have the ability to sort the queue, their review queue, in terms of accounts that have indications that they contain CSAI instead of first in, first out. So that also has a positive effect on our reviewers' well-being, because when you sort the queue in order of likelihood that it contains CSAI, you know you're getting the worst of the worst offenders off the site as quickly as possible.
That's great. Thank you so much. Erica, would be curious to know, how that compares or differs and what's worked with Vimeo.
Yeah, well, there's actually a lot of similarities in the type of technology we use. So we also use what we call the Turner effects, which is what Chango was mentioning about image manipulation, like the saturation and blur to any CSAM. We call it CSAM, but it's CSAI as well. Clips. We also separate these clips into their own queues to reduce accidental exposure from agents while they're doing other moderation work. We also enable automated reporting of this content to NECMEC, which again reduces agent exposure. We do all sorts of other things, which I'm sure other companies do as well, which is we run uploads against the CSAM hash database. And if a hash is triggered, then that content is automatically removed and reported. We also automate internal flagging and account removal if it's necessary for terms or phrases tied to toxic content. We also work with different types of vendors, Thorn being one, but there's others that cover a large range of toxic violations apart from CSAM, because they sit on the dark web, which is a layer where we don't operate, and they catch things that we wouldn't be able to find otherwise. So all of this combined definitely reduces Vimeo's moderators' exposure to harmful content. And obviously, in addition to this, we work with Naheed with the Workplace Wellness Project, which is a fantastic resource, and it has made an impactful difference in our team when it comes to moderators feeling they have the support and a way to process whatever they may experience while doing the job.
Wonderful. It's so helpful to hear from those who are, again, directly on the front line with this issue or this challenge. Justin, I'm curious from your perspective. So Spectrum Labs has been working with UGC hosted platforms for a few years now. How would you characterize your customer's journey on this and dealing with toxic content?
Yeah, how would I characterize it? I would say it's a mixed bag. In some cases, like the two here, which aren't customers, but just in general, they seem like they're doing a fantastic job. For others, not so much. The way I would phrase it, or a quote I've heard that really resonates, is if you don't have the budget for trust and safety infrastructure, then you don't necessarily have the budget for a social platform in and of itself. And that doesn't just mean the tooling, the dashboards, the workflow. It means everything that goes into supporting and facilitating the trust and safety function. Everything from policy work and the people that are needed on the back end there to set up community guidelines and understand enforcement rules and policies there. It also covers tooling, of course, the technology that can detect and flag things, the nefarious content that users are pushing through the platform. It also goes into just the overall design of the product functionality or the social platform in and of itself. So when you think about safety by design elements and rolling out new features, you need to contemplate what the impact is going to be on not just your users from a safety perspective, but also what's going to be the impact on your moderators as well. And then the last piece goes into what the rest of the folks here have been saying, which is, the ancillary services on the back end that go into creating a healthy work environment for these internet frontline workers, the janitors of the internet, if you will, these passionate, awesome human beings that are tasked with keeping the internet a safer place. They need help and services and support infrastructure that make sure that they have a healthy balance in what they're trying to do and achieve with content moderation.
That's a really great segue to talking about creating this sort of supportive environment, which you've all touched on. And Naheed, knowing that the Workplace Wellness Project, this is core to what you help advise and organizations on doing. Knowing that tech is only part of the solution, what other components of a wellness plan should organizations and individuals themselves be thinking about to protect moderators?
Have to meaningfully commit to protecting its frontline teams, whether it's through investing in technology or whether it's in any other wellness initiative, it has to subscribe to two beliefs. The first of which is that there are significant mental and physical health risks associated with doing this work, including the risk of developing vicarious trauma and post-traumatic stress. The second of the beliefs that it has to buy into is that the organizational context in which this work is done can either mitigate the risk or it can exacerbate the risk. In the absence of this buy-in, then any wellness programming is pretty, the hope for it is pretty dim. So from my perspective, the most essential components of a wellness program is to create what we call respectful visibility of the teams who do this work, particularly at the level at which resources are allocated. So some simple steps that we step into to do this is that we change the language used to describe the work. The term content moderation from our perspective neutralizes the true nature of the work, and it reduces the urgency that is essential to bring resources to it. Using the terms such as digital first responders or working on the digital front lines helps to give this work the gravitas and respect that it needs. And encouraging on the real world impact of this work and not the negative publicity that often accompanies it in the press helps to create a culture in which risk mitigating teams are given the same respect as revenue generating teams. Explicitly naming the successes, whether it's preventing child abduction, whether it's preventing a school shooting, whether it's managing medical misinformation. If we celebrate these with the same gusto with which we celebrate product launches, it brings recognition and positive recognition to the frontline teams, and it integrates them into other fibers of the work, including the tooling and the policy and product launches, which brings them the visibility and integration into an organization structure from which historically we know they have been excluded and siloed into this work, which is too hard for people to wrap their heads around. So those, I think, would be the foundational elements of setting up an organizational culture which supports resilience at every facet of this work.
That's great, and I love that you reference content moderation as perhaps like moving past that as a term. It kind of reminds me of in the opening plenary, Rashad Tabakawala talking about citizens versus consumers online and users online. So there was a quick clarifying question from the audience. There was a reference to pre-labeling content mentioned Just curious, and I'm not quite sure if that was Erica or Changos or Justin that referenced it, but I'll open it to just to circle back on that. Changos, are you able to clarify what that is?
Thank you. I think that might have been me. So I mentioned that our tools have the ability to pre-classify content. What that means is when we report content to NCMEC, our reviewers not only go through to verify that it is CSAI, but they'll also classify it according to an industry standard of classification. So they use A, B, 1, and 2 to designate the age of the child and the severity of the act that's taking place. And this can help to sort of prioritize reports. So our tool, once reviewers have already gone through it, affirmed that it's CSAI, classified it accordingly, the content already shows up pre-labeled if it's a repeat content so that reviewers don't have to go through the same process over and over again. I hope that clarifies it, but please feel free to let me know if not.
Thank you. So just continuing on for Changos and Erica specifically, I mean, what are the biggest gaps in tooling or safety tech that you wish could be solved for today? And we'll start, Chango, since we have you on, we'll start with you.
I would say video hashing is a big one for us. We've generally seen an increase in video content being reported. And as I've mentioned before, video can be the hardest to review just because reviewers have to watch it. It's more likely to stick with you. There is no centralized video hash bank, no industry centralized bank for this, the way there is for, with photo DNA, there's industry hash banks for photos, but there isn't really an industry centralized bank for videos. And there's no ability in our tools to state exactly where the abuse occurs. So our reviewers have to watch the video or rely on thumbnails, which prolongs exposure to this content. I would say a second thing, there are a lot of false positives in the industry shared database for photos. There are a lot of reviewers trying to get a lot of this content off the site quickly. And so, there are mistakes that are made when a reviewer says, yes, I think this is CSAI, and it goes into the industry shared database. We have our reviewers put eyes on everything, but you might imagine that if there's a company that automates this, say, we're going to use the shared database and just automatically report, automatically disable a user's account if there's a match, you can imagine that false positives would be really difficult to deal with. Mm-hmm. And the third thing that I would say is sort of identifying / exposure to new content. Most of what Dropbox sees is repeat content. And new content, as you might imagine, is the worst type of content because it could imply that a child is currently in harm. But it is also the most impactful since it means that case will always be prioritized and we could save a child from current abuse, which has happened before. And I also want to stress that this is really repetitive, monotonous work for the reviewers. And so one of the things that really boosts their morale is when they hear news of an arrest from law enforcement or for the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, especially when that arrest involves a minor that's saved from further abuse. Because they often don't know sort of the end result of their work, right? It gets classified and reported off into this sort of black hole. So whenever we get news of an arrest, it definitely lifts the morale.
That's great. Erica.
Yeah, Chango's basically just read my wish list. We share most of the same desires for the development of the industry. But I'd say just one more thing to add is that obviously, at this time, technology is still not able to make decisions or to help in cases where context makes a real difference in determining whether a specific piece of content should be taken down or not. So there's still too many instances where human reviewer is absolutely indispensable for making a decision. So yeah, any advance in that area would be also in my wish list.
That's great. I know that's a lot of the work that at Thorn we've been focused on are things like developing video hash and mitigating false positives, that kind of work. So Justin, I'm curious to know What do you see as the biggest challenges or that you've witnessed or experienced in protecting content moderators? We'll lead with you, and then anybody else that has, some thoughts on that.
I think I would break it into 3 categories: tooling, external optics, and maybe burnout. From a tooling perspective, it really gets into a lot of what Chango's saying around the tooling and the way that people are reviewing content. A lot of what's happening today is still very manual. There's a lot of people in the loop, and that will always be the case. I mean, AI or any technology is never going to fully remove humans, nor should that be the goal, really. There's always going to be cases where you're going to have humans in the loop. But we're still, whether it's text, voice, video, images, we're still very much in a manual era of content moderation across the board, from all different sizes and types of social categories and networks. And so that tooling has to advance. And there's significant challenges that need to be overcome to make that a reality so that more things can be automated. A lot of that goes into the fixing false positives and updating the technology that is used to flag and label content so that whether it's hash databases of imagery or any other type of toxic conversation, those things can be identified in a more automated manner so that the human moderators can focus on the things that are really important and require their intervention. From an external optics standpoint, social pressure and doxing of moderators, I think, is a big one that comes into play with protecting moderators. They're in such a, especially for the high-profile social networks, and that includes dating and gaming and of course, the broader social platforms and marketplaces. They're in a high-profile position where the decisions they make can really impact a user's experience within the platform. And if they get it wrong and the folks know who the moderators are, then that exposes them to risk. And so I'm not sure if every content moderator fully understands that when they're getting into the field and understanding that they could be attacked in some way. And so companies must do a better job in general of just making sure that those protection layers are in place by whatever means necessary to make sure that that when they're doing this good work in keeping people safe, that they're also kept safe as well in their own personal lives. And the third one's burnout. It's grueling work having to review this stuff, no matter how much is automated or manual, you're thinking about it all day. And I think as a society, we haven't fully understood yet the societal impacts of all of us, 7.7 billion people seeing toxic content all day and what that does to civility, democracy, society at large. Imagine having to look at this stuff and think about it and process it and have discussions around it every single day, day in, day out. And that can be grueling. And so I think, that's one of the biggest challenges is just how to think about managing that burnout. And thankfully, some folks here have shared some really good ideas around how to mitigate that by, blurring stuff and giving breaks and having wellness things that they can point to. But yeah, those are the 3. So tooling, external optics, and burnout are the 3 that we see.
That's great. It brings us back to the human experience. So Naheed, I'm curious to know if you have some perspective on what you've seen and what you've seen perhaps even more specifically work.
Yeah, I think, just building on what the 3 categories that Justin spoke of, I can, touch upon tooling definitely. We see it not just as the absence of sophistication of tools amongst different companies. And it's not that the tooling isn't there, or the tooling is there, but every company has a different access point to it, or they have it implemented to different degrees. Now, if a company A has a certain blurring tool, company B doesn't, then that speaks to, there seems to be a gap in the protections, even at the level of basic protective tools. And one of the gaps at the human level we see can also cause it. One is the lack of resourcing for the work, but it's also the historical relationship we see between the frontline teams and the builders of the tools. That the more conflicted this relationship, the slower the bugs are fixed, the slower the protective tooling or harm reduction tooling is made. So the cleaner the relationships and the more supportive the relationships in those companies, we see that the resilience tooling is of a standard which is more protective than in companies that the relationship is conflicted. So building more supportive and understanding relationship between these two partners is part of what we focus on, because in the absence of it, very simple bug fixes which have tremendous impact on the moderator or the first responder takes too long to fix. So there's the gap that can be attended to with an intentional focus of giving both these teams equal credibility in the workflow. The societal impact, that Justin spoke of, we are seeing it more closely as to the personal impact on the teams. We know that from experience that people who are working, for instance, with child exploitation content, how we parent our children once we are exposed to that content can be very different if we weren't exposed to it. How we are as partners when we are exposed to sexually explicit adult or child content is very different than the way we would be had we not exposed ourselves to this content. Our basic trust in humanity diminishes with the more exposure that we have, and therefore it is the organization's responsibility to restore that trust by restoring protections as an antidote to the breakage of trust that is viewed for 8 to 10 hours in the day.
Yeah, that is so beautifully said. I just wanted to respond real quickly to the first thing you mentioned, what you kind of touched on, which is there's really a lack of standards that are agreed upon across all different types of social platforms as it relates to whether it's tooling or the optics or the wellness infrastructure that should be in place to protect moderators. And that's I'm hoping that that's one great thing that can come out of what Charlotte and Clara and team over at TSPA and the Oasis Consortium and many others, the Fair Play Alliance, are all doing to try and push these kind of standards forward so that there is a common layer. Because one of the challenges that we still see, even to this day in 2021, is that when brand new social platforms come out, a lot of times they don't have trust and safety people on staff when they're launching, or even a year into the product, like some of the more notable ones still don't have, which is insane. So, having some level of common standards across social platforms, I think, would be a very welcomed idea, so that we all agree to and accept what is the baseline functionality and job safety standards that should be in place for content moderation teams and many others who work in this field.
Mm-hmm. Justin, a moderator that I work with and we work with said it beautifully. And he said that it's in our company, I feel I'm driving the Flintstones buggy while my colleague at another company is driving a Tesla. So I think that really encapsulates what you're speaking to, is the absence of standards or a baseline that can be shared.
And I think a reason that happens is a lack of common alignment at the executive level. Not every company sees it the same, right? Like every trust and safety team we've ever talked to in 4+ years of doing this screams from the mountaintop that there's not alignment internally around their tools, the resources, the people, the staffing, the policy, all the things that they need to get the job done. They're woefully behind. But when you talk to most executives for a lot of these companies, they'll say, hey, we obviously don't want these things on the platform, but there seems to still be a disconnect between what happens at the highest levels and then what actually gets implemented at the trust and safety level.
Yeah. We hear that quite a bit at Thorn as well, that lack of consistency, especially considering how new and emerging this whole field is and the demand is. Which gets to just a couple questions from the audience that I think are probably most appropriate for Erica and Changos. One question, these are, I think, a little bit related. So if you want to take a moment just to kind of speak some perspective or give your perspective on it. What kind of professional background do content moderators have, or what do you look for? And then secondly, what are your views on outsourcing or offshoring content moderation versus in-house? Erica,
Yeah.
we'll start with you.
Yeah, so in terms of the backgrounds, I think many of the people that work in our team, at least, come from a customer service, customer support background. There's no specific profession that you need to have or training that you need to have to be part of our trust and safety team. And I don't think there necessarily needs to be a specialization as such, but there definitely needs to be infrastructure in terms of training, support, all of the things that have been mentioned throughout this session for people that are doing this work, because really the impact on a personal level is huge. So more than, you learn the trade when you're working on it on a day-to-day basis, you learn. So you don't really need a specific training in that sense. What you need is training and support to be able to deal with what you're doing. So in that sense, I think the focus needs to be on that part of the work relationship rather than on trying to develop a specific profession for doing trust and safety work, if that makes sense.
Makes sense. Changos, anything to add on that?
Yeah. I think the one thing that I would add is we have sought content moderators who have done this type of work before. The reason being that, I came from a previous large company where there were a lot of people right out of college, just really hoping to get a job there. And, you try to give them warnings about the content that they're going to be seeing, and it doesn't quite seep in that this is the worst of the worst content that they're going to have to be looking at for at least 8 hours a day. So a lot of people will say yes to that, but then when it actually comes down to doing the work, they'll burn out so quickly. So, we seek people who have done this type of work before at previous tech companies. And we're also just looking for people who are really mission driven. We talk a lot about why they want to continue doing this work, because you are going to see horrible things. And what's going to get you through it is sort of being mission driven and remembering the end goal, that this is helping kids. And the third thing that I would say is, because wellness is so important, that's also one of the things that we screen for, sort of what importance do you place on wellness? So we'll ask questions like, we have this amazing wellness program in place, thanks to Naheed. What are your thoughts on wellness, and how would you feel about attending some of these sessions? And we've had people say, I don't think it's for me, which is kind of, an unhealthy culture to bring into the team, where we want wellness and resiliency to be at the forefront of our program. So that's also another thing that we look for.
Wonderful. Any perspective on offshoring versus not in-house? Or
all of our contractors are in-house. I have found it much easier to sort of keep tabs on their wellness, establish relationships with them, to have an open flow of communication and to build that trust. But, that's not to say that as our content that needs to be reviewed grows, we will need to, and currently are looking into outsourcing options. But in terms of keeping folks well, definitely in-house, I think, is the best.
Yeah. Okay, so we are coming up. There's one other audience question, which Erica, I think you're a great person to take. And then I'd like to take a moment to get some future-looking views from the group here. But the question, Erica, is how should legal frameworks develop alongside companies to continue prioritizing content moderation, health, and safety as challenges grow?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think it also links to what Justin was saying earlier about the lack of standards and the lack of just generalized benchmarks almost. So I think the development of the whole safety tech industry, the healthy development of that industry, is not going to be able to happen if we don't have the right regulatory framework that allows companies to continue to innovate and to invest in development of new tools. So definitely the regulators and policymakers need to be thinking about the type of framework they're putting in place that will allow companies to do that, and that will not stifle innovation in this space, because obviously that will have a direct negative impact on human moderators. So how should the legal framework develop? Well, there needs to be, one of the things that I've been advocating for many years is regulators and policymakers need to be speaking with people that are working in industry. They need to be speaking with trust and safety professionals to really understand what is the day-to-day work, what are the challenges that the industry is facing, what are the solutions, the technology solutions that are working, and which ones are not. So this is communication, dialogue, stakeholder engagement is absolutely key to be able to put a regulatory framework that works for everyone and that is conducive to more investment and more development of this type of technology. As we were saying, like perhaps in many places there's the discussion currently happening about what type of measures companies need to take to protect moderators, whether they are in-house or outsourced. They need to be. The discussion is whether they need to be given certain type of support by default, not whether it's not optional, right? That type of thing needs to happen for sure.
Wonderful, thank you. So we are coming up on time, just a few minutes. I would love just to hear from each of you. This field is so new. Like, what does the future of content moderation look like? How is it seen through wellness, the lens of wellness? Like, do we have more humans, more tech? Like, what are some of the trade-offs? And so we'll start with Justin.
Oh, goodness. I think these prediction ones are always interesting. I think that there'll be a tighter connection and correlation between community health and revenue. I know a lot of folks in the space have been screaming that for years, but having actual verifiable metrics of before certain decisions are made and after they're made, and tying that connection together will hopefully unlock more budgets at the executive level, which will ultimately trickle down to trust and safety teams and make it more available for programs that tie to wellness and making sure that not just the tooling is improved and the processes are improved, but making sure that they're protected. So the more that we can connect it to that and make that case and actually show verifiable data, I think that's what's really going to drive the stuff forward, barring any policy changes to things like CDA 230, but that's a whole other can of worms.
Right. It goes back to you talking at the beginning about this not being a cost center. Eric, Changos, we'll start with you. Like, what do you see for the future?
I definitely think, I know larger companies in this space are making a lot of progress with AI and machine learning, but personally, I believe there will always be a need for humans in this space. We've seen that reviewing is more of an art than a science. There are definitely nuances in determining the age of a child. Context can matter in determining whether abuse is occurring. So that's my take. There always need to be a careful balance, but will always be a need for humans.
And Erica, the last minute or so.
Yeah, all I say is that from being in policy and regulation, like there's already regulation coming from all parts of the world that are putting content moderation at the center of debates and that are bringing a lot more, are making it a much more important issue even for leadership. So that's great in the sense that now people are really going to have to look at it whether they want to or not. And that's just, I think, in my view, just going to lead to more investment and hopefully faster development of better solutions. And in terms of the trade-off, I think I agree with what Chango's just said in the sense that, the more you want to keep your platform and community safe, at the time being, the more you need to rely on human reviewers being exposed to some sort of harmful content. So that's the trade-off, right? And so our focus needs to be on protecting those moderators now.
Wonderful. Naheed, I think we can squeeze in your thoughts on this as well. I'd love to hear.
Okay, I think whatever direction it takes, it has to take into account the experience and the voices of the frontline moderators. They should have a say in the direction, the policy, the legislation. They should be integrated because they know the work the best. So whatever direction it is, I would advocate for the first responders to be part of the planning.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all so much again for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us here today in this audience. Thank you, audience, for your time and attention and your questions. Encourage you to join the closing plenary now. And again,